Hi there, thank you so much for tuning into my channel. I'm Opal Portia Organics, or OPO for short, and I cannot wait to bring this video to you. This is a real passion of mine, this topic, because I know, for one, when I was starting out on my hair journey, hair porosity was just really confusing to me, and I get it, quite rightly you should be confused, because there's a lot of confusing information out there. Especially when you watch a video and you're like, I get it, and then you touch your hair and you're like, no, I don't get it, I have no clue. That's okay, because I actually think there's a lot of misleading information about hair porosity out there, and I've come here today to really clear away a lot of that mystery and really explain to you what hair porosity is. So let's get into it. I am super excited about this topic. Hair porosity is something I see time and time again, confusing the hell out of people, and I'm not surprised. It's not as clear-cut as a lot of people say it is. So, first of all, why am I crying? Weird. Anyway, so what is hair porosity? Well, hair porosity is defined as the hair's ability to absorb and retain moisture. So basically, how our hair absorbs moisture from the atmosphere or from a moisturizing source and then retains it within the makeup of the hair strands. So the hair strand structure, that's a tongue teaser. The hair strand structure is made up of shafts that lie across the hair strand along the cuticle layer, the outer layer of the hair strand, and the inside the cuticle layer of the hair strand is another layer, but then in the center of it is the cortex. So what does that actually mean? Okay, so for us, what that means is, does your hair absorb and retain moisture easily or with difficulty? So the argument, whenever you come across these characteristics of low, medium, and high porosity, they break up into three simple categories. These hair shafts that live on the outside of the hair strand can either be quite raised, can be quite tightly packed in and then densely packed along the hair strand, or they can be quite distant, far in distance away from each other. With low porosity hair, what you often find is that the shafts on the hair are densely packed in on the hair shaft and are actually quite close to the cuticle layer. So they lie quite flat and tight and close to it. This means that when moisture comes into contact with the hair strands, it has a difficult time of actually getting under those shafts. They're densely packed and they're quite hard to get under, so it struggles. That's why often characteristically low porosity hair finds that hair beads start to rest on the top and the surface of the hair before it slowly starts to sink in. But it's also why low porosity hair often will show that when it is moisturized, it stays moisturized for a very long time. So for those naturals out there that find that once they finally do get that moisture into their hair, they find that the hair just stays wet for a really long time. I'm talking 1, 2, maybe even 3 days. If you air dry, that's an indicator that you have low porosity hair. High porosity hair, in contrast, is made up of a structure where the shafts of the hair are quite raised away from the cuticle layer, the outer layer of the hair strands, and they're not so densely packed, so you will find that there are actual gaps between these shafts, wider gaps than you find with low porosity hair. What this then in turn results in is when moisture comes into contact with the hair strand, the moisture can very easily slip underneath the high porosity hair shafts and get to the cuticle layer of the hair. But it also means that because they're porous on both sides of the hair strand, the water escapes very quickly as well, leaving you with essentially still dry hair, which is frustrating unless you seal it in with some sort of butter or a heavy oil to act as that extra barrier on the outside, so once the moisture actually goes in, it stays in. This is why with a lot of high porosity naturals, they find that their water will readily go in and it loves a bit of water, but then it's really hard to hold on to it. So it's this constant drying cycle that has to be maintained, more so than with low porosity hair. It's also why the hair tends to be a bit more brittle, because it is more likely to break off because of this dry effect that it's exposed to on a regular basis, because it's just not holding on to its moisture. Logically, that would suggest, therefore, that normal porosity hair is somewhere in between these two types, with low porosity showing itself to be a bit stingy, not letting anything in, and the high porosity hair being a bit too free and open, letting it in or letting it out. Medium porosity hair is essentially something that allows moisture in quite easily and only really lets go of moisture quite sparingly. So the shafts of the hair sit comfortably on the cuticle layer of the hair, on the outer side of the layer of the hair strand, and allows a fair amount of moisture in and then locks onto a fair amount of moisture without letting a lot of moisture escaping. But with the added use of a barrier, say like a medium to light oil, that moisture will stay there pretty much by itself. Great, best of both worlds. The problem with these labels is, how on earth are you supposed to know that you have normal, medium porosity hair? Compared to what? Compared to someone's hair down the street? Compared to your hair yesterday? Compared to your hair tomorrow? Compared to your hair when you were relaxed? What? What does it all mean? How can you be normal to relative to what? It doesn't make sense. I'm a bit skeptical of the porosity test. You know, there's a porosity test that's going around, which is basically where you have a glass of water and you put the strand on the surface of the water, and depending on what porosity your hair is, will determine over 30 seconds or less where your hair will sit in this glass of water. So the idea is that if the strand sits on the surface of the water, then you have low porosity hair. If it sits in the middle of the glass, then you have medium porosity hair. And if it goes all the way to the bottom, if it sinks all the way to the bottom, then you have high porosity hair. That doesn't quite work. And I think it's actually a very misleading test. Why? Because it depends on what part of your hair you actually test. For instance, you could do this test 3 times in a row and use different hair strands with different porosities, and you will get different results, and you will be just as confused as you started out with. Okay, so one thing that I find very confusing, and quite rightly you should be confused about hair porosity, is when you watch a video, you see that someone's saying, oh, my hair's high or low porosity, and it doesn't like this, and it does like this, and it acts like this. And then you come to moisturize your hair and you're like, well, it kind of responds like this, but it also kind of responds like that. What does that mean? Am I a freak? No, you're not a freak. 9 times out of 10, if you have natural hair, what you are likely to find, like with most people's hair, you probably have a range of porosities within your hair. For instance, my hair has 2 types of porosity predominantly. It's about 80% low porosity from root to here, and then my ends are most definitely high porosity. How do I know that? Because I look at how my hair responds to different ingredients and to different types of liquids and creams, heavy oils, butters, and lighter oils. I know this from experience, and I don't want you to start thinking that you have to choose if you're low porosity or high porosity, because the chances are, like I said, you probably have a bit of both, and I'll tell you why. The reason why most people have a variety of hair porosities on their head is because of wear and tear, maintenance, and the aging of our hair. Our hair porosity can very easily change if the hair is not being maintained in the correct way. If moisture and protein balances are not being managed correctly, and it's being treated in one way when it should be treated in another. So I think the reason why a lot of naturals struggle with their hair porosity, or even identifying their hair porosity, is because it's a bit of a myth, the idea that you only have one type of porosity in your hair. I certainly have found that during my journey, my hair has changed. The texture and porosity of my hair has changed. And that is because of manipulation. That is because of the age of my hair. It varies along the way, along this journey. That's why it pays to really get to know your hair, and everyone's hair will be slightly different. So for instance, if you say, I am a low porosity, I have only low porosity hair, what you're going to tend to do is only treat it like low porosity hair, despite the fact that you probably have different porosities in your hair. Same with if you're high porosity. So for instance, I find with my hair that from here, about here to here, my hair is low porosity. It behaves like low porosity hair. But my ends, they behave very much like high porosity hair. And there's a logical reason for that. When it comes to hair porosity, I think it's better to see it as a sliding scale because your hair will change over time. This is due to age, this is due to manipulation, and this is due to genetics. Generally, people can't really change their hair texture per se, but what you will find is that your hair's porosity may change over time simply because of how you're manipulating it. Everyone knows, or most naturals out there know, that your ends are your most delicate part of your hair because they're the oldest part of your hair and they need the most maintenance. And that is true. Your ends go through a lot more manipulation than any other part of your hair. That means that the porosity of your ends is most likely to be different from the porosity of the rest of your hair. So I found in my experience that if I treat my ends like high porosity hair, as opposed to the bulk of my hair, which very much behaves like low porosity hair, I find that the maintenance of my ends is better than if I treat it like low porosity hair. Reason being because it holds the same or very similar characteristics to high porosity hair. It's very dry a lot of the time, no matter how much I seal it with an oil. It likes its butters and heavier oils on there to seal in that moisture, and it's prone to breakage because of the dryness that it experiences. So what I do is often I will go in and seal my ends with a heavy shea butter or coconut oil or olive oil or something just heavier to help coat those strands and reduce the amount of breakage, because as we know, the best way to grow your hair and to have healthy ends and ultimately healthier hair is to look after those ends. They are the oldest part and they do need more TLC. But it also means that they are a different porosity to the vast majority on your head. The other thing is that realistically, most people probably have all three types of porosity on their hair. And I'll tell you why as well. Sebum is the natural oil that is created and builds up on the scalp, on our scalp. It's naturally produced by the body, and in people with, say, straighter hairstyles, they find that this sebum buildup often leads to what they call greasy hair. That is because that sebum that has been allowed to develop over time will naturally start to make its way down the hair shafts to the bottom if they leave it indefinitely. Doesn't really work like that. Actually, it will start to self-regulate itself the less you wash it, but that's for a totally different story. The same applies to our hair, but of course, because we have curlier strands, that sebum takes longer to actually make its way down our hair strands. So it actually needs more coaxing. But what does this mean in terms of porosity? Well, sebum is there to act as a natural barrier of oil that the body produces to help protect our hair. The roots of our hair will have a high volume of sebum on them, which means that they will probably be very well protected by this natural sealant made by our body. That would mean that they are most likely to act and behave like normal porosity hair or medium porosity hair. However, because the sebum struggles to get down, especially to the ends of our hair, what you often will find is that naturally occurring oil-based sealant protectant will not be present on the main bulk of our hair, thus leading to perhaps lower or higher porosity hair. Depending on your genetics will determine whether or not you realistically have more predominantly high porosity hair in the bulk of your hair or low porosity hair in the bulk of your hair. And generally speaking, you can't really change that. What you can change, however, is how you look after your hair. The best thing is the feel of your hair. When your hair is damp, So not soaking wet straight out of the shower, but when your hair is lightly, squeezed out and just damp, feel the texture of your hair. Does it feel very dry? Is it drying quicker than other parts of your hair? If so, it's likely to be of a higher porosity to the rest of your hair. Does it like heavy butters, or does it hate heavy butters? Understanding how your hair responds to moisture is going to give your hair the best fighting chance in terms of identifying what your hair porosity is. I would recommend starting with your ends because they are the oldest part, they are the driest and most damaged part of your hair. Giving them a bit of extra moisture isn't going to harm your hair nearly as much as perhaps overloading your hair with moisture anywhere else in your hair. Also, they are an indicator of basically the most maintenance that you will need to give to your hair because they've gone through so much more than any other part. Your ends, 9 times out of 10, are going to be of a higher porosity to the rest of your hair. The way I would start is by adding moisture, just very basically, either through water or aloe vera, maybe the mixture of the two, but essentially starting there with just water, and then seeing what they like to be sealed with. Do they prefer a lighter oil that doesn't lead to product buildup and doesn't lead to a tacky feel? If so, that probably means that they are low porosity. However, if they really benefit from having a heavier butter on them once to seal in that moisture, and for a good 1, maybe 2 days, they stay moisturized, that's an indicator that they are of high porosity because you're sealing in that moisture effectively. And that's the point. Outside of that, it's about understanding how you manipulate your hair and making sure that you're manipulating your hair appropriately. Once you've got a better understanding of how your ends respond, you can then start to progress higher up your hair and start noticing what products does the bulk of your hair like. Does when you are fresh out of the shower and you're going in after you've deep conditioned and you go in with your moisturizers, does your hair like a cream-based leave-in conditioner or a water-based leave-in conditioner? If predominantly the rest of your hair likes maybe more of a lighter water-based leave-in conditioner, then that is an indicator that you have low porosity hair, which only needs to be sealed in with, say, a light oil like grapeseed oil. If, however, when you go in with moisture, you find that you're constantly, you never seem to have enough using you don't seem to ever have enough moisture in your hair from those liquid-based leave-in conditioners, and you really benefit from having a creamier-based leave-in conditioner, that's an indicator that your hair is of higher porosity. It's always a relative thing. Porosity is a sliding scale, and your low porosity elements of your hair will vary even within the hair strand, as will the higher porosity elements of your hair along the hair strand. But it's about the average way in which your hair feels. Generally, I find that my ends will predominantly feel higher porosity and respond as higher porosity hair would. And for the predominance of my hair above my ends will tend to behave like low porosity hair. So I find that keeping an 80-20 rule with how I moisturize, using a liquid leave-in conditioner and then a heavier sealant, or maybe a cream leave-in conditioner on my ends and a heavier sealant, works best for my hair. And then on the bulk of my hair, I'll just use a very light oil. This has worked wonders for me, and I've seen a lot of growth and a lot of health during my time on this journey. And I want the same for you. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. If you want more information on anything that I've spoken about, please let me know in the comments below. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and subscribe if you want to hear more and see more from me and get updates as to when I'm posting videos. Thank you so much again for tuning in. I'd love to hear some of your stories about how your hair journey's going, what you found in terms of porosity, and if you found this to be informative. All the best, and until the next video, take care.